The only non-human animal to contract COVID and pass it on to humans has been identified. It's the mink, and it's claimed at least one person's life in Utah. This has the potential of being like the next Wuhan markets, right?
Exactly. It really does. I mean, there's a wet market operating in Utah, 36 of them every single day. Every single one of these mink farms is like another wet market where we know the virus already exists on 12 of them. That's what's crazy. 1/3 of these mink farms already have the virus.
Making people care about COVID mink. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, several European countries have culled their mink farms due to COVID, but the U.S. policy has been like its overall COVID policy, slow and lacking urgency. Mink are the only non-human animals known to get COVID and pass it back and forth to humans. Jeremy Beckham is the Utah Animal Rights Coalition person who's trying to change the policy there. He describes the danger in ignoring the threat of COVID mink on the PETA Podcast.
We're not seeing the same problem on other animal agricultural facilities. You know, pigs don't get COVID, cows don't get COVID, but mink do. Mink belong to a family of animals called mustelids. And the cells that line their respiratory tract have the same sort of receptors, even more of those receptors that line our respiratory tracts. And that's how the virus makes entry into these organisms.
And so is that because they are more like us or similar to us? They're the only non-human species that gets COVID, apparently, right?
We have seen COVID in a few other, we've seen it in house cats occasionally. But what is unique about mink is we think that mink are the only species where the virus passes in both directions. So the virus spills back from humans. Humans who are infected with COVID first bring it onto the farms and infect the mink. Then mink spread it amongst each other. And then what's particularly dangerous is then the virus spills over from mink to humans. And that's what's unique, is they call that bidirectional zoonotic transmission. And the reason that public health epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists care a lot about that is each time a virus transfers from one host species to another, that organism's immune system kind of makes its own unique imprint on the virus that's then shed. And what that means is that you start to get more mutations. And we've already seen just in the last few days what mutations to COVID can do. There's a variant that's already spreading in the UK. Now, there's no reason to think this particular variant, came from mink, but nevertheless, it shows the risk that variants pose, because this variant that's now spreading rapidly throughout the UK is more contagious. And if you have even more contagious form of COVID, that risks overwhelming our hospitals even more than they already are.
Yeah. But they say it's more virulent, more contagious, but is it perhaps less deadly? I mean, I heard people try to make that logical link, but is that logical at all?
It's too soon to know. And that's the hard thing. Every time one of these variants manifests itself and emerges, we have to study that variant all over again and see how it's transmitting, what the clinical signs of this new variant are. And there's the very, real threat that if one of these variants emerges that modifies what's called the spike protein, that spike protein is the target of essentially every vaccine we've developed. The Pfizer, the Moderna vaccines use the spike protein. Pretty much every other vaccine that's in development uses the same target. So what this means is that if we get a variant of COVID where that changes, that's almost what identifies the virus for our vaccines to work. And so this mass vaccination campaign that we're struggling to roll out, it'll all be for naught if we get a variant that arises on one of these mink farms that changes that spike protein. So there's really a few different mutations that are of concern. You can have a mutation that changes the virus's contagiousness. It can change its clinical impact and cause more mortality or more morbidity, or you can also get what are called antibody escape mutations, and that's where viruses then are missing it, or it escapes our immune system. So all of these are reason for concern. And when you have a population of non-human animals where this virus is just constantly simmering and then occasionally spilling back over and affecting humans, that's a real cause for concern. That makes it, very difficult to ever eradicate the disease if we have a non-human reservoir of the virus. And then also it creates the real threat of mutations. And we're already seeing in the UK, and I believe we will see in just in the next few weeks, this mutation spreading rapidly with community spread in the United States. So we've already seen the risks and the threats of variant strains of COVID.
Yeah.
And as long as we keep these mink farms open in the United States, we're just going to keep rolling the dice. And I mean, we may play Russian roulette with this successfully for a few months, but I mean, I am telling you, if we don't do something to get ahead of this, eventually these mink farms will be responsible for a mutation in the United States of this virus.
All right, Jeremy, they took care of it in Denmark. They took in most places in Europe, but in Utah, haven't they closed down the mink farms?
They have done nothing to close down any of the mink farms or limit breeding. As far as numbers of animals on these farms, it's just business as usual. The state has the authority to order culls or to shut down these farms or to stop breeding, but they have yet to invoke that authority. The only thing that the state has done is enforce quarantine orders. And there are 36 mink farms in Utah. We're the second largest mink producing state in the country. There are 36 mink farms in Utah, and right now 12 of those farms, so exactly 1/3 of Utah's mink farms, have active COVID outbreaks and active quarantine orders. And all that means is that these farms can't buy and sell live mink to other farms, and that goods and services that are exchanged between these farms have to be quarantined. But the farm workers' exposure to these mink has not really changed in any meaningful way.
So we're talking about workers who go in there. They don't test the mink. They don't know if the mink are, well, some mink are quarantined, you said, right?
The whole farm has a quarantine order, but there's not really, honestly, there's not practically a way to quarantine mink once you get a COVID outbreak. I mean, when you have a COVID outbreak on these mink farms, according to media reports, it affects thousands of them. I mean, the virus just spreads rampant. They're very susceptible to this virus. It kills a huge portion of them. And so, realistically, there's no way to quarantine every infectious mink on these farms. They're just crammed into these tiny sheds. There's just not space. There's not a logistical way to do it. If you cram thousands of mink in a shed, you are going to get COVID circulating on these farms. Right. It's just a matter of time.
But people can also see if there are dead bodies, right? They could see if the mink are impacted and ultimately get sick and die, right?
And that's one thing that we've discovered since the last episode. UARC has been fighting for more transparency, both from the Utah Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Both of these agencies have been very reluctant to release any information. But we did get records from Washington State University. And the reason is because they have a diagnostic laboratory there that the USDA uses. So they sent some samples of dead mink who were suspected to have COVID. And we got those test results as well as some email communications that authorities in Utah had. And what we learned from those records is at least one manager on a Utah mink farm in Utah County actually died of COVID. And several other workers reported respiratory infections. So, it's very likely that this virus is just constantly swimming on these operations, going from mink to mink, human to mink to human. It's a highly contagious respiratory virus among both species. And this is a really serious concern. It's already killed at least one person, a farm manager. And these farm workers are likely then carrying the virus into the community at large. They're going grocery shopping. They're meeting with other, family gatherings more than likely. And so this is a source of community spread, almost surely, that the state of Utah is doing almost nothing about.
And so what happens to the workers if they were, say, vaccinated? Does the vaccine have any impact, and does it protect them? Or is the vaccine going to be worthless to a mutation from the mink?
Yeah, that's a good question that needs to be studied, and it's probably not being studied, unfortunately. What we need to do is we need to do what they did in Europe, which is prospective whole genome sequencing of both workers and the mink. Because then what we can do is we can match up those sequencing results chronologically and determine conclusively if mutations are occurring in the mink and if those mutated forms of the virus have then already spilled back to the humans. We're probably not doing that. And I say probably because the state of Utah has been so adamant against releasing records that it's hard to know exactly what the state of Utah is doing. And these are some of the questions that we're trying to answer through our records request. But everything that I've seen indicates that they're not doing that kind of testing, probably because they're afraid if they did do that testing, that if we did identify mutant strains, we'd probably have to shut down these farms. So, we'd rather not know. That's right. That's kind of our official policy response here in Utah. Let's not know.
But this has been the official policy of the United States. Ignorance is bliss, right? That essentially, to paraphrase or use that phrase, it's been the federal response from day one under the Trump administration that the more you know, we better not say, or we better know less to not alarm people. But here we are in Utah, and what's the COVID situation in Utah? What is the availability of ICU beds and hospitalizations? Where is Utah right now? Like every other state, California, I'm in a county that has 0 ICU beds right now.
We constantly flirt with 0 here as well. I'm not sure, day to day, our ICU capacity varies, but we are experiencing yet another surge, probably as a result of holiday gatherings. And we had our highest positivity rate we've ever recorded the other day. We had something like a 35% positivity rate, which is just staggering. We've broken our record for number of cases just the other day. It was right around 5,000 cases. So we're setting new records here for COVID in Utah, just like they're doing almost everywhere in the United States, I think. And I hate to say it, but I don't think we're at the worst of this yet. I mean, we still haven't seen the results of Christmas time gatherings, and also this variant strain that we're seeing in the UK. They have already identified some cases in California and in Colorado. Very likely that it's here in Utah as well, but we're not doing the kind of widespread genomic surveillance that they're doing in Europe to even know. The problem is likely even worse than we know.
Well, people visit Utah for a variety of reasons, religious reasons, cultural reasons. You might want to go and visit Zion or any of the great national park facilities there. And if you're traveling and you might be a source of the spread. And so here, let's just reset. You said that in Utah, they're experiencing the same high levels of COVID that most of the other states, like similar to California. It's high. You mentioned a 35% positivity rate where ideally it should be 5% or less. Now you're talking 35%. And then on top of the human condition, you have the mink condition. And Utah is second to Wisconsin? What is the top state in the
That's right. Yeah, Utah and Wisconsin are number 1 and number 2, and I've seen over the years those two states switch places, so we're almost tied with Wisconsin for being the top mink producing state. I think we may have more farms, but fewer mink produced on those farms, something like that.
And what are they doing there in Wisconsin? Anything as far as the mink go?
As far as we know, they're doing the same thing that they're doing here in Utah, which is just issuing quarantine orders for the entire operation. But really, that's very inadequate because within that operation, again, there's still going to be transmission between mink and then from mink to humans. And the other thing that's really troubling to me about the state of Utah's response, and this has been the case from day one with COVID on mink farms, is the state of Utah is bending over backwards to try to downplay the threat. That's very apparent to me. They're trying to just ease people's concerns. And you even had just last week, the State Department of Agriculture put out a press release that said, good news, everybody, the number of COVID cases on Utah mink farms has decreased a lot in the last few weeks. And I've got news for you, folks. The reason that it's decreased a lot on Utah mink farms is because we just had culling season. So the way these Utah mink farms work is you have a small number of the mink that are the breeding stock. It's usually like 10 to 20% of the total number of mink on a farm at its peak. And that breeding stock carries over from year to year to year to year. But the rest of the mink don't live a full year of life. There's a breeding season that usually starts at the end of February, beginning of March, where they breed the breeding stock. And then the kits that are born from that are raised until culling season. And culling season is usually around Thanksgiving, okay? Beginning at end of November, beginning of December. And then in between culling season and breeding season, these farms are largely depopulated. There's only like 10 to 15% of the number of animals, period. It's just the breeding stock that's there right now. And so, of course, you're seeing fewer COVID cases on Utah mink farms because there are fewer mink. Yeah. There are fewer mink to be infected. And the mink that are there, because these farms are so empty, can be distanced out. And it will be harder for a virus to spread like wildfire in the shed. But mark my words on this. This spring, March, April, May, when these farms repopulate, it's going to come roaring back. I have absolutely no doubt that mink are going to get widespread COVID infections this spring, right at the time when we're going to want to be ramping up our vaccination efforts. And if a mutation arises on one of these farms during breeding season, I just think we're going to look back with disbelief that we allowed these 36 farms, which aren't even turning a profit. By the way, mink farming is no longer even profitable because consumers are rejecting fur as an ugly display of cruelty. So they're not even turning a profit. So in my mind, that makes these 36 mink farmers hobbyists. They're raising and killing mink because it's some fun hobby for them to do.
And in the meantime, they're also raising COVID.
And in the meantime, they're raising COVID. So The state of Utah thinks protecting the right of these 36 unprofitable operations to exist is worth threatening the public health of literally millions of people in Utah and then the whole country as well. And I just think it's just an insane calculus that this state has arrived at, that it's worth the public health risk to protect this dying tiny industry.
But Jeremy, what they feel is that this is an economic boom to the mink. They see the economy lifting if the mink business can stay afloat. If you cut out the mink farms, what happens to those jobs? I mean, you say that the mink business in terms of the profits on fashion are not as not where they were, but there's an economic interest that keeps the practice afloat, right?
There's all kinds of economic interests that we've had to sacrifice to try to get a handle on COVID. I mean, every single restaurant and bar in Utah, believe me, 2020 was a devastating year for them. How many of them folded up shop? And we basically just told all of those businesses, tough luck. I'm sorry, but this is a global pandemic that's threatening to kill hundreds of thousands of people. And we may have to make some sacrifices, which, those are very tough trade-offs. And so I think it's, just insane to look at, you take all of the dozens and hundreds of restaurants that went out of business in 2020 to tell those businesses that were previously extremely profitable, you all need to go out of business, but these 36 mink farms, they're special. And even though we know that they're way more of breeding grounds of thousands of COVID cases than you are, just the kind of special treatment this industry's getting. And it's all because of our political system. Yeah. It really is. Well, the agricultural lobby is so much more powerful in Utah and even in the country than the hospitality industry is. And that's why they're able to get these special protections, even though the public health threat they pose is far greater.
Well, Jeremy, have they shut down the restaurants and bars? Can you still go to the restaurants and bars?
Well, we've gone back and forth through lockdown. So up until just a few weeks ago, Governor Herbert, that was our governor before yesterday. We just barely got a new governor. But he had issued an order that said all the bars have to close at 10 p.m. every day. And this was devastating to bars. And we've seen restaurants and bars in Salt Lake that literally have existed for several decades close their doors for good in 2020. So, I mean, the economic consequences have been severe for that industry. Whereas you look at the mink farms, what's incredible too with that is the state veterinarian here in Utah gave a presentation to the CDC where he said that they've been giving financial compensation to the mink farms to get their cooperation in the investigations into the COVID outbreaks. So the state here is actually doling out money to the mink farms while watching all of our restaurant and bar industry and all these other restaurant industries just get slammed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just obvious how much special treatment this industry is getting.
And it's ironic too, because they're funding what could be, or is, if what you say is true, it could be the COVID hotspot for the West and maybe the nation.
Yeah, and I mean, we even know even when these mink farms were operating under normal circumstances in 2020, there were constant COVID infections simmering on these mink farms. So it would be, the proper analogy would be like if we allowed some restaurant to continue operating as normal, even though their workers were reporting to work every day with active COVID infections. We would never allow that. Surely that would be punished by the health department, to just allow workers knowingly to report to work sick. That's what's happening on these mink farms every day.
Right.
I mean, it's just endemic on these farms now that they're infectious.
But you said that there have been some cases, or one or two cases, where the mink, the workers have gone into the community, and has there been any tracing to indicate that there's a danger when mink to human instances can spread throughout the community?
The best research we have on this is from Europe. Again, because we have this mentality here in the United States of let's not know. So I'm not aware of any robust epidemiological studies even being conducted here in Utah to answer those questions. What we do know from Europe is that researchers published a study in Science, which is one of the largest, most premier peer-reviewed publications in the world, where they looked at infections of COVID on mink farms in Denmark. And what they found is that 68% of the workers and those workers' immediate contacts had COVID infections. 68%. That's a much higher incidence rate than the baseline of infection of COVID in the population generally. The study authors concluded there's just no way that this isn't facilitating community spread. In northern Denmark, they said that it's very possible that the majority of COVID infections ultimately originated from mink farms, if you went back and traced it. I mean, that's how these infectious diseases work, is you get an index case that's responsible for a cluster that's responsible for an enormous amount of community spread. They think that there was a conference in Massachusetts, the Biogen conference, and that one conference that was done back in February was responsible for hundreds of thousands of COVID cases in the United States. And if you have an existing reservoir like a mink farm is, where this virus is just constantly circulating and percolating, it's inevitably going to be a source of community spread because nothing is being done to stamp that out.
All right, they were smart in Denmark. They culled the mink, and then they had problems. There were reports in November and December about what they called zombie mink. They were so quick to cull, to get and to bury the bodies. They put them in shallow graves, and that because of the decomposition, the gas from decomposition, the bodies were sort of floating to the surface, sort of like in Denmark. I guess that's kind of like Hamlet's ghost, I guess, in a way. But there it was. What's happening in Denmark? Do they regret that they maybe the haste in which they disposed of the bodies, the mink bodies, but do they regret having essentially shut down the mink industry?
I don't think that they regret shutting down the mink industry. I do think that the way they disposed of the bodies, in hindsight especially, wasn't great. I mean, they think that it may have even had the potential to contaminate groundwater. So disposing of the bodies is definitely a logistical problem. However, right now, like I was mentioning earlier, we are in between culling season and breeding season. So the best way that we could get a handle on this is to get ahead of the curve and not have these bodies to deal with and not have to do culls. Right now, the state of Utah could issue an order telling all these farms, don't breed for the next season. 2021, you will not repopulate your sheds. The public health risk is too great. And then we wouldn't even have this concern. I mean, if we just had the breeding stock on these farms, even that would do a lot to curb the threat. I mean, fewer mink is always going to be better than greater mink. So we could avoid that problem by just saying don't breed. I think that right now we have this narrow window of opportunity between now and early March where we really could intervene and stop a problem before it arises.
Well, what would it take? You got a new governor there.
But we're going to reach out to him just like we reached out to his predecessor repeatedly. And there's no question he has the statutory authority to do this.
Who's the new governor?
His name's Spencer Cox. Spencer Cox was the lieutenant governor of the previous governor. So he's already been kind of involved in a lot of, and he also headed the COVID task force. So, I'm sure this has crossed his desk before already, but there's definitely going to be a renewed push on our part to get his attention to this issue, because right now there is a window of opportunity that Spencer Cox could intervene and shut down breeding on these mink farms. And he has the statutory authority to do so. There is a section of Utah code that allows the governor to do this.
It's interesting. We just don't hear anything about this, because it was in Denmark. We heard a little bit in some of the mainstream papers about, the mink farms maybe in October and November, and then nothing. And now you're saying that this could be the next source of a spike, especially since now they've identified that mink are the only non-humans to get COVID and to pass it. It has the capability of passing the virus back and forth.
Right. And I have to say, we're not hearing about it ourselves in like the mainstream media. I agree with you. The mainstream media needs to pay a lot more attention to this. But I have to tell you, I have a master's in public health, and from my, days going through more public health schooling, I'm on quite a few email lists of infectious disease experts. And one of the main ones is called ProMed, which is an email list of the International Society of Infectious Disease Specialists, something like that. And believe me, scientific experts, infectious disease experts are talking about this a lot. There are emails almost every single week about new cases identified of COVID in mink farms, the threat of COVID in mink farms. In Ireland, their top infectious disease expert, he's basically their equivalent of Dr. Fauci.
Right.
He said that COVID on mink farms is one of the greatest public health threats, and they responded and shut down their mink farming industry there. So honestly, this is sort of a unique problem in the United States. In Europe, they're getting ahead of this problem quite a lot. And the scientific literature, if you go to PubMed, which is the National Library of Medicine, and type in COVID mink, you'll find quite a lot. There's a lot of peer-reviewed publications where experts are talking about this problem a lot. The problem is getting the mainstream media to focus on this. And the mainstream media, I've never seen, to be frank with you, such a sorry state of affairs of our media in terms of scientific literacy. The bodies of mink in Denmark, captured all this attention because we could call them zombie mink. Right. And isn't that a catchy thing to tweet? But the trying to explain bidirectional zoonosis and a lot of these scientific concepts, you start to lose a lot of the media because their attention span is like that of a toddler.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like if they realize that this has the potential of being like the next Wuhan markets, right?
Exactly. It really does. There's a wet market operating in Utah, 36 of them every single day. Every single one of these mink farms is like another wet market where we know the virus already exists on 12 of them. That's what's crazy. 1/3 of these mink farms already have the virus, and it's just going to become endemic on them. It's never going to be eradicated unless we develop a veterinary vaccine for it, but that would be years and years away. And so it's the problem is not going to magically go away. And I think we have this problem in this country of magical thinking with COVID. We think, by Easter, it'll be gone. We're turning the corner. How many times have we heard our elected officials say these kinds of things only to have the second spike and the third spike and the fourth spike? And it's not going to solve, the problem's not going to be solved unless we dedicate ourselves to solving it. It's not going to solve itself. Viruses are going to do what they're going to do, whether we're, monitoring the situation or not.
All right. So now we know that the mink are this one non-human animal that can pass it back and forth between humans and mink. But the last story I saw in the New York Times was how mink were discovered in the wild in Utah. What can you tell me about that, and how does that somehow change the equation or impact the equation?
That's right. And that's another troubling development with this is, we think that the wild mink, so what happened was the USDA did some wild trapping of different wild animals. They trapped skunks and I think foxes and mink and a few other wild animals, tested them all for COVID, and they found one wild mink who had COVID. And let me tell you, when you're trapping wild animals, you are always getting a tiny sample of what's out there.
Right.
So if we trapped one mink and that one mink happened to have COVID, you know that there are many more out there. And this mink was in the immediate proximity of a fur farm. So they were very likely an escape. Escapes happen all the time on these mink farms. These are not BSL-4 laboratories with a lot of security measures and containment measures. They're actually, I've seen them with my own eyes. These mink farms are rather porous. There are feral cats coming in and out of there. And some of the feral cats they trapped also had COVID near these mink farms. So these mink farms are not just going to be a public health risk because of workers carrying the virus off. They're going to be a threat to wild populations as well, because wild animals are going to get exposed to the mink through escapes, or just through direct exposure through things like the feces, because the mink shed the virus particles in their feces as well. So, I mean, they're just going to be a breeding grounds of this virus for humans, for wild animals, and we're already seeing that now. And if we don't get ahead of the problem, it's just going to continue to spiral out of control.
Now, I've seen some other reports that say that Russia and I believe Finland are working on a vaccine for minks specifically. Is that going to help, or how does that, is that vaccine similar to the vaccines that are applied by, that are used or developed by Pfizer and Moderna and those that are intended for human consumption? Or is it a totally different kind of vaccine?
Well, any veterinary vaccine is going to have to go through its own trials and a regulatory approval process. And they haven't even started that yet for a mink vaccine. And actually, the mink farming industry already has had a problem with vaccine shortages, even for existing diseases like Aleutian disease and mink enteritis and a few other diseases that they routinely vaccinate mink for on mink farms. There is only one producer of these vaccines right now for the entire industry. So they already have a bottleneck effect. And adding one more vaccine that they're going to have to go through the approval process with. And the thing is that we are not producing enough of this vaccine yet for humans.
Right.
And so, believe me, the mink are going to be well behind in the queue. They're going to be, after every single nursing home has been vaccinated and every single healthcare worker is vaccinated, maybe we'll get to the mink. So, pinning your hopes on a mink veterinary vaccine anytime soon, I think is real pie in the sky.
Yeah,
it ain't coming anytime soon.
But in the meantime, as we vaccinate humans and as humans try to distance, if we ignore the danger in the mink population, this mink reservoir of COVID, we leave ourselves exposed to another front in this war against the disease or against the virus.
Exactly. And we have never eliminated any disease ever that has had a reservoir in domestic animal populations. And that's just an interesting fact in public health history. So we didn't eradicate smallpox in humans until we eradicated smallpox in cattle. We had to take care of that first. And the same concept is going to apply here. I mean, as long as that reservoir exists, there's just going to be moments where it spills back and infects humans. And, to me, to threaten our vaccination and eradication efforts just so 36 people can have their little cruel hobby, it's just an insane trade-off to me that we're making.
Well, but that's the thing. It's in Utah, it's in Wisconsin, and is it, people come and go from these places, and there could be spread from the mink, but maybe people on the federal level see it as maybe too isolated, maybe small instances compared to 300 million throughout the country.
We're dealing with the global pandemic right now that all started from an isolated incident. Respiratory viruses that are highly infectious, all it takes is one spillover incident.
Right.
And you have a global pandemic, especially with all of the global travel we have now. We're a very interconnected society. So, my neighbor down the street that died of COVID, that all started because someone in the Wuhan wet market last year had contact with a bat or a pangolin, we think. We don't know exactly what the spillover event was, but it was one incident that started this entire global pandemic. So it would be irresponsible to say, oh, this is just an isolated problem on 12 mink farms in Utah. It's not going to stay 12 mink farms in Utah. Next year, it'll probably be 25 mink farms in Utah, and all it takes is one farm worker getting exposed to one mutated form of the virus and then carrying that virus off the operation into the community, and it's over. We've got community spread that's wildly out of control. We're not even monitoring it to know a variant could have already arisen. That's what's crazy, and we wouldn't even know.
Right, and it has the impact also of essentially making less effective any kind of vaccine that we're having a hard time getting out to the people right now.
Right. The virus could be mutating into a form that escapes our vaccines, could be mutating into a form that affects children more than the dominant variant of COVID does. It also is just resulting in more cases. I mean, even of the existing variant. I mean, it's just, in Utah, whenever we have a school with a handful of children that get COVID infection, we shut the whole school down until we get that outbreak under control. But with mink farms, we just allow it to just continue to percolate and simmer and spill over month after month after month, and no one is bothering to get it under control. I mean, it's really insane.
So right now, the pelts, I understand that it's sort of counterintuitive. While the mink have died, I guess it's created a shortage so that mink prices have gone up. I read in the press.
I mean, my guess is that the mink industry right now is undergoing an incredible amount of volatility. They used to sell their pelts through these things called auction houses, and almost all of these auction houses have gone belly up in just the last couple of years. The largest one was the Copenhagen one. They went bankrupt. So the normal way that they facilitated the exchange of these pelts has gone haywire now. So some mink producers are stockpiling pelts that they're not able to sell. Other ones are finding buyers at higher prices than normal. Meanwhile, mink farms in the United States are going out of business left and right. And the good news, I guess you could say, in all of this is even if the government never gets ahead of this problem, market forces are already starting to drive mink farms out of business. Yeah. I hope that those market forces act quickly enough that that they shut down the farms before they're responsible for a serious outbreak of a variant strain. But even in Utah, several mink farms, we don't have exact numbers, but we just know from our own sort of informal research that several farms went out of business in 2020. Several more will probably go out of business in 2021. The industry really is in a state of free fall, and they were in a state of free fall before COVID. And that has to be stressed. I mean, even before COVID, the price of pelts was plummeting. The number of mink they were raising and killing every year was decreasing every year for the last 5 years. And then you add on top of all of that, COVID has threatened global trade. It's been a lot harder for them to trade their pelts to other countries because of just COVID impacting global trade. And also just the disease itself has ravaged their populations. I mean, some of these mink farms in Utah, the COVID killed 40% of their animals.
All right. So just to clarify, the pelts, even if it was a COVID infected mink, are the pelts still usable, or does the virus die when the living being, mink dies?
Right. Viruses pretty much all viruses need a living host to live for very long at all. It may persist on a surface for a little while, but most research shows that COVID doesn't really transmit too much through surfaces. And probably if you left those pelts out for several days, whatever living viral particles that were on there would die eventually. So probably the pelts themselves are not a very serious risk of transmission, but the pelting process is. The pelting process is probably a very risky process because whoever is killing that animal is in very close proximity, face-to-face contact, very high likelihood of transmission there. And that's the real concern is workers on these farms carrying virus off the farm.
And people don't realize that enough. I mean, we hear about the workers in a poultry shed or a meat packing plant. People know about that in the Dakotas, around the Midwest, but they don't hear about the mink. And the mink is probably more in terms of creating deadly mutations. It's on record that this is where those mutations are created in the mink population in Europe and possibly in the United States.
That's right. And the important thing to remember is, like with poultry slaughterhouses and cattle slaughterhouses, that is all human to human transmission. I mean, those
Yeah.
chickens aren't bringing COVID into the slaughterhouse. It's just workers getting the virus, getting infected from their family or their community, coming into the shared workspace and then infecting coworkers. Right. With mink, you could not walk into those barns for a month and it won't make a difference because the mink are passing the virus amongst themselves back and forth, and they're acting as their own reservoir for the virus, whereas chickens are not.
So right now, Jeremy, you with UARC, the Utah Animal Rights Coalition, what's your game plan or your plan of action in terms of you got a new governor there? That's, I guess, is the strongest, maybe the best way to maybe see a change in policy to get to the governor?
Yep, and we're mobilizing thousands of our members and supporters to send the governor messages. We've reached out also to our state public health officials, like our state epidemiologist. We're trying to get the local media, almost every single day. I'm emailing various reporters, trying to get them to pay attention to this issue. It's been a struggle because the state is counteracting everything that we're saying. The state veterinarian is saying there's no risk here. There's no mink to human transmission. And so reporters are having a hard time sifting through the fact that my message is conflicting with state veterinarians' messages.
Well, wait a minute. There's no question that the mink do transmit COVID to humans, and that the species do, that a mink with COVID represents a threat to human beings.
Yeah, there really is no question. We've proven it conclusively through genomic sequencing and study after study. Nevertheless, our state veterinarian is continuing to repeat this lie. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It really is a lie. But I still, personally, I've always had this uphill battle. I've been involved in, advocacy work for 20 years. And I'm just telling you, it doesn't matter how much evidence you have. If there's someone who's perceived as an authority figure saying contrary information, you always have an uphill battle. It doesn't matter how much evidence you have. They get away with saying, take another example. The University of Utah can, even in the same news story where they've violated the Animal Welfare Act, they get away with saying, we comply with all federal laws and regulations.
Right.
And it's like, no, you don't. We have a report right here that shows you don't, but they still get to say that. And it's like reporters sometimes have difficulty reconciling the fact that sometimes people in authority are giving them misinformation.
Well, this is part of the spin and the lie, and we've seen it perpetrated in the last 4 years on a federal level, and we see it happen all the time. It's the tough part about being a reporter or being a journalist to get at the facts, and then to see it kind of undercut when another side is presented and the other side gets away with not more information, but with just a bald-faced lie. So,
yep. And the thing is, they have this fancy title. They're the state veterinarian. And to, your average layperson, I admit, a state veterinarian sounds more authoritative than someone representing an animal rights organization. So there's a credibility gap that we have there. And, we try to fill that credibility gap as much as we can with evidence. Right. Which is on our side. We have the evidence on our side. They have the more authoritative title on their side. And sometimes, I hate to say it, but the authoritative title wins out over the evidence.
Well, president versus president of an animal rights concern tends to do that. And the model is out there for all to see in public view right now. It's part of the last 4 years of our national politics.
Yep.
But hopefully science will win out. The truth will win out. Jeremy, I wish you well, and I hope the next time we talk, we're talking about maybe some kind of positive policy change when it comes to mink. It's just unbelievable to me that more people don't know that mink is the only non-human animal to contract COVID and to pass it back and forth to humans, and people don't know that. I mean, it's not your dog, it's not your cat, it's not zoo animals necessarily, but it's the mink. And for the reasons that you described earlier in the podcast. And I just think that it's, once again, it's a matter of knowledge and information and people's unwillingness to let people know, because we the way that we have addressed COVID as a nation, and at certain state levels, has been ignorance is the policy, the best
Exactly
policy.
right.
So
Yep.
it's unfortunate, but I wish you well, Jeremy. Let's talk again soon. And how can people, if they want to see more about the efforts of UARC in trying to change mink policy in Utah, and I imagine if you change it there, you might have a shot at changing how mink are dealt with in Wisconsin.
Yeah, exactly. And I encourage everyone to visit our website, which is UARC.io. And we have action alerts on there. If you are listening to this and you're a resident of Utah, I think you have a particular bit of leverage that non-Utah listeners may not have. And so I'd encourage anyone listening who's from Utah, reach out to our organization and get involved. Take action on all of our action alerts. And you can email us at info@uarc.io.
All right. Jeremy Beckham, a former PETA podcast, well, always a PETA podcast contributor, but a former stalwart member of the Laboratory Investigations Department, and now heading up a grassroots concern that's very effective, the Utah Animal Rights Coalition. Jeremy, thanks for joining us on the PETA Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a delight.
Jeremy Beckham, former member of PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, on the move to get Utah to shut down mink farming there and perhaps across the nation because of the threat of COVID. And that's our show this time out, our 4th season. We're starting our 4th season. Thank you very much for listening. Watch for video coming soon. Yeah. And you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can also rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.